Hi, my name is Harmony Webb, and for my final project, I decided to go with the First Amendment, freedom of the press. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today, just kind of like an overview of the key concepts and the cases. So let's jump into it. First, I'm going to be talking about what is freedom of the press. So the definition to me is freedom of the press is a constitutional right that protects the publication of information and helps ensure that the government cannot censor or punish journalists for what they report. This protection is considered essential to a functioning democracy because it allows the public to stay informed, hold leaders accountable, and openly discuss issues without fear of retaliation. So, just some key points overall: freedom of the press is our constitutional right. It protects the ability to publish information. It prevents government censorship and retaliation. A free press is essential to democracy, and it ensures public accountability and informed citizens. Now I'm going to talk about the legal foundation of freedom of the press in three brackets. First, constitutional basis, next, the role of the Supreme Court, and then limitations and standards. So, constitutional basis, the First Amendment provides the foundation for press freedom, stating that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the press. Although brief, this language establishes a broad protection for the publication and distribution of information. Now, leading into the Supreme Court, because the Constitution doesn't spell out how this protection works in practice, the Supreme Court has played a major role in interpreting and applying it. Through landmark decisions, the court has defined the right of journalists and set boundaries for what the government can and cannot do. Now, some limitation and standards. Any attempt by the government to restrict press activity must meet very strict legal standards. Courts generally view censorship or prior restraint as unconstitutional, except in extremely limited circumstances where the government can show a compelling interest. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the key legal concepts of freedom of the press. So, first is prior restraint. So, prior restraint is when the government tries to stop information from being published ahead of time. Courts have ruled it's almost always unconstitutional to do this because it goes against the basic purpose of press freedom. Now, balancing government interests. So, sometimes the government argues that limiting publication is necessary for national security or public safety. Courts weigh these claims against First Amendment rights and usually only allow limits if serious and immediate harm can be clearly shown. Now, some defamation and libel. The press can still be held responsible for false statements that harm someone's reputation. When the case involves a public official, the law requires proof of actual malice, meaning the publisher knowingly lied or acted with reckless disregard for the truth. And now, protection of public debate. The Supreme Court stresses that open discussion and criticism of government officials is vital to democracy. Even harsh or inaccurate statements are often protected to prevent discouraging public debate. For the first case I chose to show freedom of the press is Neer versus Minnesota in 1931. So the facts of this case is Jay Neer, who was a publisher at a newspaper, accused local officials of corruption and unlawful behavior, and Minnesota officials used a state law to shut down the paper, claiming it was malicious, scandalous, and defamatory. This law effectively allowed the government to block publication before it happened, going back to showing that immediate harm was going to be caused. So, reasoning, the court said that allowing the government to censor publications before they are printed would be a direct attack on freedom of press and could easily be abused by officials trying to silence criticism. Even if the content is offensive or inaccurate, the government should not stop it before publication. Instead, individuals can seek legal action afterward if needed, like defamation suits. They ruled in the Supreme Court that the Minnesota law was unconstitutional because it enabled prior restraint, which goes against the First Amendment's protection of freedom of the press. And the main significance and conclusion is almost never has the authority to block publication ahead of time. This became a foundation principle of press freedom and set the stage for future cases where the government tried to prevent the release of controversial or sensitive information. Another case I also wanted to touch on that really goes into freedom of the press is New York Times versus United States in 1971. So, a little overview of this case is the New York Times versus United States, known as the Pentagon Papers case, was involved the Nixon administration trying to stop newspapers from publishing classified documents about the Vietnam War. The government argued that releasing the documents would harm national security and asked the courts to block publication, raising the issue of prior restraint. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the newspapers, stating that the government did not meet the high burden required to justify censorship before publication. And the importance that this case played into freedom of the press is that the decision reinforced strong First Amendment protections by making it very difficult for the government to prevent publication, even if it was sensitive information. Now, I'm just going to touch on the four main reasons why this still matters. So, the four key reasons to why the freedom of the press is still relevant and matters in our society and constitution is because leaks and whistleblowers, misinformation challenges, ongoing legal debates, and holding power accountable. And mainly like legal or leaks and whistleblowers, it's just modern leaks often reveal government misconduct or hidden information. And it's crucial for reporting these stories without fear of censorship or punishment because we as the public need to know these things. So, just a little summary, the First Amendment's protection of freedom of the press ensures that journalists can report on important issues without fear of censorship or punishment from the government. Without these protections, the government and powerful institutions could silence critical reporting, preventing the public from learning about corruption, abuse of authority, or decisions that affect their rights and well being. Thank you.